Good evening. Welcome to our book launch of Dr. Ethan Porter's The Consumer Citizen, book published by Oxford University Press. Dr. Porter is an assistant professor in the School of Media and Public Affairs. I am Sylvia Weisbord, the director of the school. So I would like to make some very brief introductory remarks, and then we're gonna get on the conversation. So what can I say about the book? Read it. It's a great book. It's a terrific book. It's thought-provoking for a number of reasons. It builds off Ethan's extensive research. The book has a wealth of evidence. Let me say a few things that I love about the book. I think, first of all, the book asks great questions. The book sort of, it has this thing that I love, which is sort of trying to figure out puzzle, asking a question that may be simple, but actually it is a puzzle. So for example, why do people oppose taxes? We have asked that question many times probably. And I think what Dr. Porter does here is trying to go beyond some of the obvious answers and trying to tease out sort of what's going on there. And I think that this is particularly a relevant question because one of the key issues in the book is about framing choices, about how governments and other actors frame choices, frame questions. And of course, that has been a central question, especially for our school, for what we teach, for what we do research on. And actually, what is interesting about the book is that you might agree or not with the central arguments of the book, which is how do we rethink conventional notions of citizenship? But actually, even you agree or not, the book will nudge you to rethink some of the essential premises about key concepts in political communication and political science. What is citizenship? What is policy? How do governments communicate? How do governments frame policy choices? And I think, at least in my own experience, the book was what the book did for me. It pushed me to sort of rethink what I consider to be sort of conventional wisdom in the field about some of these essential concepts, and pushing me to think what would be the problem, what would be the advantages if we think about citizens as consumers. Why yes, why not? Why some people may be skeptical about it, why some people will embrace the notion of yes, we should think about, or governments or other actors should think about citizens as consumers. So anyway, I could go on for a long time, but that's not what we're here for. What we're here for is to listen to Ethan Porter talk about her book, and Dr. Kim Rose, also professor in the School of Media and Public Affairs, to share some ideas about the book. So I turn it over to Ethan. Thank you very much for this opportunity, Ethan.
Hey, thank you so much for those really kind words, Professor Weisbord. Thank you to Jen Halpin and Sarah Creasy and Doug Zimmerman for organizing, and of course, Professor Gross for agreeing to talk with me. This would not be happening without them. And thank you all for your interest in my book. This book is the byproduct of a very long process. I actually looked in my Dropbox a few weeks ago, and I noticed that the first item I'd ever put in there related to this book was more than 8 years ago. So this has been research of mine that stretches back for some time. But it even goes back farther to that. When I was growing up in Northern New Jersey. Northern New Jersey, if you don't know, is sometimes called the mall capital of the world. People spend a lot of time shopping there. Now, I've always been a political junkie, but the discrepancy between my obsessiveness and the lack of interest of other people has become much more interesting to me as I've grown older and to continue with my studies. Robert Dahl, the great political scientist, once said that for many people, politics is at best a sideshow in the circus of life. And if that's the case, then you've got to ask, what do people do with their time? And it turns out that the sort of shopping people do in New Jersey isn't that unusual. Americans overall spend a lot of their time shopping. Evidence in the book bears this out. With that in mind, the question then becomes, does all this time people spend as consumers come to shape how people behave politically? William James, the great late 19th century psychologist, had a story that has been sort of informative on my thinking. And James relayed this story about a military veteran who, while walking many years after he'd left the military, was yelled at by somebody who wanted to sort of play a joke on him. And this practical joker yelled out, "Attention." And the veteran, who hadn't seen battle in many years, promptly brought his hands down and dropped his food. Not at any battlefield, the veteran was nonetheless obeying the command that had been issued to him. Might the frequency of consumer decisions come to structure our political decisions in a similar way? As consumers, we expect things to go a certain way. That's not how the government works, though. And to understand the consequences, I'm going to read a brief excerpt. In 2001, George W. Bush, then George W. Bush, was pursuing a tax cut. The New York Times interviewed Chris Martin, an air conditioning repair salesman. Chris Martin said, "You get taxed enough on so many things already, it's better to get something back." Now, we all know, if you're on this call, that of course, Chris Martin gets lots of things from government, but at that moment, he wasn't aware of or wasn't thinking about them. Now, to make sense of this, consider what Martin's typical weekend might look like. He probably receives a paycheck on Friday. He notes, as usual, that it's slightly less than he would like it to be. The government has taken its sizable share. That evening, he takes his wife out to a restaurant. The following day, he brings his children to a playground. He spends Sunday working around the house. He fears he pulled a muscle, so he takes a painkiller. While he spent the weekend aggravated by the costs imposed by government, he takes advantage of three complex benefits: healthy food, public parks, and safe prescription drugs. Yet he likely never connected any of them to government. And on those rare occasions when he does make explicit use of government services, say by casting a vote or signing up for a government program, he probably has to confront a blizzard of paperwork that leaves him exasperated. Now, given the salience of government's costs, the near invisibility of its benefits, and the frustrations often associated with using its services, the consumer citizen may come to punish the government. In this context, punishment amounts to voicing support for policies and politicians that would diminish government spending. While a consumer can choose to spend less at a vendor that has fallen out of his favor, a citizen can only vote for politicians who promise to reduce the cost of government itself. In this person's mind, the government has acted just like an unfair company. He will punish them as he would the company, by withholding his support. Now, in this vignette, there are echoes of what we think of as the submerged state, right? There are echoes of this idea that people have trouble connecting the government to the benefits it provides, but there's something more broad too. As consumers, we expect the benefits we receive from goods we buy to roughly align with costs. We expect to pay a fair price, and we get mad when we don't pay, or when we don't pay a fair price, when we feel we've been cheated. Government rarely affords us that opportunity to connect benefits to costs. Now, in the book, I describe how Trump voters are especially likely to bring this set of expectations with them to government. But here's the thing. In the book, I also make clear that appealing to people as consumers can change people's minds on a host of topics. People appeal to as consumers, I've shown in some cases repeatedly. When you appeal to them as consumers, when you make clear that government benefits and costs are roughly aligned, you can make people to become more supportive of taxes. They can become more willing to tolerate higher tax rates. They can come to trust the government more, and their willingness to sign up for the Affordable Care Act can even be increased. Now, it's easy to glance over my sort of description of the consumer citizen and bemoan the rise of consumerism and the marriage of consumerism and citizenship. It's easy to do that. It's easy to complain that people don't approach politics as we might want them to, in as sophisticated a manner with as much political knowledge as we have. But this book, in my opinion, is about what's more important, which is that by recognizing people as they are, and by approaching people as they are, we can actually change them, in some cases fundamentally, in ways that we might find desirable, and in ways that come closer to approximating the sort of standards of citizenship that resemble conventional wisdom. That's a brief summary of the book. I'd love to chat with Kim and the rest of you. I'd love to hear about your thoughts.
So thanks, Ethan. That is just great. I just want to quickly echo, and then I'm going to ask Ethan a few questions, but just quickly echo a few of Silvio's points. This is an amazing book. I recommend it to everybody. Just a couple of quick highlights that I just want to stress from the book is how much it reminds us, right, how our kind of consumer selves really do intersect with our political selves, but also I think takes this approach Ethan is just noting, right, which is oftentimes people think of this as like a negative thing. And he points out the ways in which actually we need to sort of meet people where they are, understand this, but this actually can be a positive way to really think about politics. It also, you know, it's really smart. It engages with the literature. It takes what might seem like a kind of obvious point, right? That look, people don't spend time on politics, but they spend time on consumer things all the time, and draws that out in ways that help us sort of rethink certain kinds of basic kind of theories and understandings we have in politics. I think the other thing is for anyone looking to do experimental work, this is a model. I mean, this is a book that shows us how to do really great experimental work, really interesting field experiments. That he's just to be commended for the sort of amazing amount of work that's gone into showing this. I think it offers some important lessons for our students in political communication and journalism and thinking about the importance of how things are framed and sold. And then, you know, not to be underestimated, it's also just a really well-written book, which some academic books are not. This is a really well-written book and a really joy to read. So I do recommend it to everybody. Just want to start, Ethan, with just a couple of questions, and then we'll invite questions from the audience. But just to start, one of your arguments here really is that policymakers who really understand that individuals think like consumer citizens and bring consumer thinking with them to politics are going to be more successful, right? Because they can have more insights into how to sell their policies to the public. So you just wrote a Washington Post piece describing your book and kind of offering a few suggestions to the Biden administration. So I'd just like to invite you to elaborate on that a little bit. What kind of advice would you give the Biden administration to garner support for the kinds of policies they're trying to sort of achieve? What would Joe Biden or his advisors learn if they read your book, and how would it help them?
Sure. So I did summarize the implications of the book for the Biden administration in the Post this week. And in that article, I laid out what you might think of as sort of 3 lessons that would be valuable for the Biden administration. The first and the most broad is don't assume that most citizens care about politics nearly as much as you do. And don't assume that most citizens care as much about politics, even as much as your most diehard supporters do. To its credit, I think the Biden campaign knew this. The Biden campaign was famously off Twitter. Don't pay attention to the sort of humdrum of daily DC politics. Instead, meet people where they are. And as I argue in the book, where people are most of the time is shopping. They're on Amazon, or they're at the mall one day after COVID ends. They'll be back doing it physically. And there are some good lessons from that. The first is, if you're going to sell a tax increase on anybody, try and connect the place which the tax is collected to the use of that tax. That's a finding that's been borne out in many experiments of mine, where it turns out people are willing to pay more for, say, a gasoline tax if you tell them, hey, this gasoline tax will actually go to making roads better off. The many other similar taxes that could be imposed, people are willing to pay higher rates if there's a direct connection between the source of the tax collection and the use of that tax money. That's point 1. Point 2, fairness matters for people, and consumer fairness matters for people. The Obama administration, when it was selling the Affordable Care Act, sort of knew they wanted to create a marketplace, and they could sort of begin to approximate some consumer ideas. But they never actually sold the ACA as being just fair. It's a fair way for you to get health insurance. And what I found in a field experiment was you can actually get people to sign up for the Affordable Care Act if you emphasize the fairness of it. So fairness is huge. and consumer fairness, meaning that the costs of what you're paying roughly match on to the benefits that you're getting back. Last but not least, the Biden administration should not be afraid to market government. This is something that we used to do in this country that we've stopped doing. We're reluctant to do so for some good reasons and some, I would say, less good reasons. Again, Obama did a little bit of this. So when you drive by a highway, you would see sponsored by the ACA, right? But there needs to be a much more aggressive effort, and it shouldn't just relate to one bill, but needs to affect the whole of government.
Great. Those are, I think, that last point is one I love to hear. When you talk about making the benefits of government transparent, right? The gas tax, right, is a kind of an obvious one. But what about that vignette you started with? How do we make safe drugs transparent to people, right? There are innumerable benefits we all get all the time that are really quite obscure. How do they think about making those more complex things transparent? Do you have ideas about that you want to share?
Sure. At the end of the book, in the penultimate chapter, I describe an experiment I worked with 2 Harvard Business School marketing profs, right? So these are guys who work all day with companies to sort of figure out what would be a good advertising strategy. And I sort of got them together and said, let's think about government. And what we did in that study was created ads for government. It's focusing on those benefits that are submerged, right? Benefits like prescription drugs, but also benefits like plumbing, right? Benefits that are really hard to even appreciate, even if you are, a political junkie, right? You don't think about these things. So again, I do think that the United States should be unafraid to engage in marketing campaigns. What's interesting is, and I don't talk about this in the book, other countries do this. So Canada does engage in sort of promotional efforts more so than the US does. We do this sparingly. We don't do it enough. And there's never sort of a whole of government approach to it, which is what I think we need to do. It shouldn't just be about, hey, this prescription drug, was provided by the government, but it's look at all the things that government does for you. I think that's really important and could be done.
Do you want to talk a little bit more about this sort of this balancing that people want to see, right? This balancing of fairness. So, what you observe is consumer fairness and this sort of sense that people want to sort of see this kind of balance, right? That what I'm, putting in taxes, I'm getting back in benefits. And that makes sense, right? That's a natural consumer thing. But the other thing consumers seemingly want is sales, deals. They want to get something, for less. That feels also like a kind of way in which consumers think about the world. But that doesn't actually seem to be what you're finding in, I think, one of your most interesting experiments, where you show that people actually they don't prefer the politicians give them more benefits relative to their taxes. Why is that? Is there something there that, it seems inconsistent with this other piece of the consumer thinking? How do you kind of pull those together, and what might be the lessons?
Yeah, thank you. Those are great questions. So the common wisdom in political science about people's attitudes toward taxes is in government services is that people want maximum government services and no taxes, that people want a free lunch. And I don't find that. And I think the reason I don't find that is actually because the phrase free lunch, actually, we all know that phrase because we know there's no such thing as a free lunch. Consumers are skeptical of, I think, free things, and there's some work in consumer psychology that points at this. But it makes sense intuitively too. If you walk by a restaurant and they said, "Hey, we're giving away food, come in and eat for free," you'd be a little skeptical. You'd say, there's something wrong with that food. That's yesterday's lunch or something. It turns out that consumer citizens have a similar attitude, which is that they don't want to completely eliminate the cost. And in fact, reminding them of the costs they've paid can make them view the resulting government services more positively. I think, and it was that finding that actually really crystallized a lot of what's going on here for me, which is that people are taking these lessons about costs and benefits from elsewhere and applying it politically. And again, we can talk about, well, maybe they shouldn't, or maybe they should, but it seems like they are. And it seems like people who are really disinterested in politics are the most likely to do so. So that, so the people on this call, we don't do that. We're actually a little more, we're more sophisticated, but I'm not talking about the people on this call. I'm talking about people whose engagement with politics is rare. And I think that's really the key thing to keep in mind, that it might be more rationally self-interested to try and maximize your the benefits you get out of government, but that's not really how people think when they're in their everyday lives. So they don't think about it when policies are at stake.
Yeah, one of the things I found interesting about that was also this, what you're just pointing out is it's the people who are less politically sophisticated, right, who do that. But in a way, the point you just made is it also seems quite rational, right? You ought to maybe be skeptical about somebody who's promising you something that seems unrealistic. So I think there's just an interesting kind of observation there that people take away some normative things from this. But I think that you've shown, right, that it's not irrational to bring this approach to the world, and actually might lead you to make, in a kind of, in another version of this, a pretty rational approach to
totally agree. There's a kind of really wide, there's some folk wisdom at work here that I think actually makes a fair bit of sense, right? You don't take things for free. I remember this is, I don't know, my 5th grade student council election. There was one student running for president who promised to give everybody Big Macs every day for lunch. And he lost his race for student council president because people found that unbelievable. And I think there's something to that, right? That people have a sort of intuitive understanding about what's credible and what's not. And having close proximity between costs and benefits is more credible to people.
Just maybe one more question. So as an experimental researcher, I love the experiments in this book. I just love the kind of, and one of the things I just love about your work in general is the ways in which you have done just, brought strong experimental evidence there, but also done these amazing field experiments in contexts that show really cool stuff. I'm wondering if you want to just maybe share what you think is maybe the most interesting or exciting experiment you did, and also maybe what was the most surprising thing you found?
Sure. The most fun, I'm trying to even, I want to recreate this somehow. In the city of Chicago, it turns out that the cost of a ticket to to go on the bus is roughly aligned with the amount that the city pays per passenger, right? So it costs, I think, $2.25 to buy a bus ticket, or it did when we ran the study, and the city pays about the same amount per passenger. So working with a group of undergrads, we fanned out across Chicago and actually conducted an experiment at bus stops where we randomly told people about the sort of alignability between what they were about to spend and how much the city was spending on them, or we told them the city's actually spending all this on you, or we just reminded them of what they were paying. That was the most fun. It was sort of catching people, waiting for the bus, really fun. People looked at us like we were crazy. But the point is, you can always do experimental work wherever you are. It doesn't just have to be over a computer. You can really take it to the streets. The most surprising finding, though, I think relates to the Affordable Care Act finding, right? For this study, we randomized postcards with the expectation that those postcards might actually affect your willingness to sign up for health insurance. This is one of those studies that, like, you put in the field and then you're like, oh my God, this is never going to work. But it did, and I think that's surprising and like, to me, really I don't know, strong evidence of the basic importance of consumer fairness. That consumer fairness, if you can appeal to it, actually gets people to like contribute hundreds of dollars a month to their health insurance.
Great. So I think we're going to turn to questions from the audience. So if you have a question, you can put it in the Q&A. And I'm just going to read some of the questions out to you. So one of our attendees asked if you can speak more about how you came up with such creative field experiments and advice for those who are interested in pursuing research in political behavior.
Yeah, great question. When it comes to experiments, I think that it's always good to really be collaborative, to try and talk to other people and understand that you might have an idea or a substantive interest. I would also, so always reach out to people and get their ideas. And, I think the Chicago bus idea, I think I'd read a paper that also involved experiments outside, right? over a computer. And that's maybe the second broad point. Like, don't feel constrained by the way that other people have done it. So if most experiments are conducted over a computer, say, okay, well, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do something else. More broadly, like be honest with yourself about what your experiments are showing. There were several versions of this book, years and years ago that did not look like what the book is now. The book is now, I think, a really honest and transparent reflection of my findings. That can be hard, right? Because as researchers, we want to, I know what the truth is, but experiments will tell you actually you don't. And then you've got to rethink what you think you know. And being open to that, I find to be really fruitful.
So a question from Professor Todd Belt. He's wondering to what degree your research speaks to Williamson and Skocpol's finding about the Tea Party's opposition to taxes having to do with deservingness, right? That people deserve services, people don't deserve services. So I do deserve services, others don't deserve services. How do you see your findings speaking to that work?
Yeah, I mean, I love their work on the Tea Party. I think my work is different because I think to some extent they, let me put it this way. I think that deservingness and perceptions of who deserves what is often wrapped up in people's perceptions of what they themselves paid. Okay, so there's a fair bit of deservedness that is race related, that is based on racial animus, but there's other deservedness, which is, well, I paid for this, therefore I should get something back in return. One hypothesis that I've always had that I've never run is that, never tested, is you could actually reduce anti-tax attitudes if you made clear to people that the beneficiaries of government services also paid in. Because oftentimes there's this sort of myth that those people don't pay any taxes, and of course that's not true. People pay taxes all the time. Everyone pays sales tax. It's just wild to me that we have this lie in this country that anyone's exempt from taxation. The final thing I'll say is that I do think that my book more cleanly speaks to Vanessa Williams's follow-up book, Read My Lips, which was hugely influential for me. Vanessa finds that Americans like taxes more than we give them credit for. And in my book, I talk about how that can be the case if we make clear to them the benefits that they receive for their taxes.
Yeah, and that's a great experiment that you should run. How do you walk the line between government advertising and propaganda? When you suggest, right, the government should advertise more, how do they walk that line?
Yeah, this is a great question. Something that worries me because it worries me in part because this is the reflexive response that I think people have, because we're so unfamiliar with the idea. Very clearly, there should be no relationship at all between politicians who seek and hold elected office and the dissemination of messages that promote government services. That seems very clear to me. I mean, to some extent, in the real world, there actually is, politicians engage in a kind of marketing, but it is always self-interested, or usually self-interested, where incumbent politicians will be able to distribute messages to their constituents. I don't support that at all, or I don't really have any interest in that. There should be apolitical people in charge of messaging, and the messaging should strictly be about what government does for your tax money. That's it. And there should be no benefits whatsoever to one party or one politician.
Another of our guests asks, could treating politics like a consumer product produce undesirable behavior in politicians, like misrepresenting policies to sell them better? So speaking to the point you just made, how do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, this question is also great. The rise of the consumer citizen is not all great news. I want to be very clear about this, right? The rise of the consumer citizen probably has incentivized politicians to misrepresent policies, and will continue to do so. I think the way out of that, though, or the sort of the converse is, well, then you've got to sort of push back and focus on messaging that can actually convey policies transparently and truthfully. There's so much money spent every year in this country on political advertising. There's almost no money spent advertising policies, and that's just unheard of. So I guess I see this problem as already being here. And I do think it would, government might have a role in reducing the number of misrepresentations.
So Rachel, who says hello to Professor Porter, asks about transparency for the consumer citizen is one thing, but what about trust, right? How do you change the way COVID vaccine is marketing to make sure people trust it and are willing to sort of get the vaccine? How do we think about that?
Great question. I am doing some work on COVID now, but I don't have results. In general, what I can say though is that the kind of transparency I've talked about actually can increase trust in government specifically, as well as changing people's views toward taxes and government spending. So in the experiment I described earlier, in which we were testing out advertisements for government, not only did that advertisement, increase people's willingness to pay taxes and increase support for more government spending, it also did increase trust in government. So I do think a fair bit of effort could be put into making transparent the government's role in COVID vaccine production and dissemination. I think that would be really beneficial and useful. And my expectation would be that those kind of messages would lead to people trusting the vaccine more. Again, I don't have hard evidence on that. It's just, I am reasonably optimistic that this kind of transparency that I describe in the book, called operational transparency, would work at increasing vaccine uptake. Operational transparency is basically, you see the effort that goes into what's being done. And I think a lot of people right now don't understand the intense role government played in vaccine production. And I do think that messages that emphasize that could go a long way in increasing trust toward the vaccine.
Thank you. So Mark McKibben, hello Mark, asks, what advice should you give the Biden administration and Congress on how to revise the Affordable Care Act in a way that would make the law more popular and sell it better?
So this is one of those unusual times where I'll say that maybe in maybe many cases, the Trump administration gave the Biden administration a kind of favor, where we're unlikely to have continuing arguments now about the mandate. The Biden administration, I think, is well positioned to focus on fairness, right? So it's not a policy change. I do think there's got to be a messaging change. And some of the messaging they've done reflects this. But again, I would argue that fairness should be front and center in a way that it has not been before. So, the Obama administration spent money on LeBron James and Zach Galifianakis and all these sort of cute ads promoting the ACA. Joe Biden's administration should focus on communicating to people, no, this is actually just a fair way for you to get health insurance. Like, this is fair. These people are, the ACA is not designed to rip you off. And people have a suspicion that it is, because, we're on guard against being ripped off, and making clear to consumer citizens that they're not being ripped off. My evidence shows that would actually go a long way to getting more people enrolled, especially in the marketplaces, which are reopening, right? So this is actually pivotal right now, I would say.
Yeah, and you have work speaking directly to this very point. Matt Howland asks, says, we know the elector is more likely to vote based on personal characteristics than policy. Do you think a candidate can win where the campaign focuses primarily on connecting government with consumerism? Right? Is the electorate going to actually kind of respond to that message?
Yeah, so I would say they already are, right? Interestingly, in one of the studies, I found both Democrats and Republicans both really responsive to consumer messaging, and more willing to agree with messages when they were framed in consumer terms. In this study, I actually imputed words. I created words for Barack Obama and Donald Trump to say. And it turns out that whether it comes out of Obama or Trump, Democrats respond to Obama and Republicans respond to Trump by sort of, following in their footsteps. So another way to think about your question, Matt, would be to say, one hypothesis or one implication of my work is that more than personal characteristics or policy, what drives the electorate, I think, in my mind, are politicians who can speak to these everyday consumer terms and speak in the lingua franca of America, which tends to be consumerism. On this point, Donald Trump is par excellence. I mean, there's so much mystery. How is Trump elected? And we have these elaborate theories, but we forget the guy is a masterful salesman and has been for 30 years, right? You could buy Trump steaks, you could buy Trump, at the sharp image, and then you could buy the Trump presidency. So, I would view the Trump administration, the Trump election, as the culmination of a fair bit of this trend. But again, I don't think it's a sort of left or right issue. I think it's common on both sides.
Professor Steele asks for you to talk a little bit more about how you can advertise the policies by keeping the politics out, right? So the Republicans will deride the Affordable Care Act, or will, even in your own terms, right? They will emphasize that there is no equity here. The taxes, you're spending a lot on taxes and you're not getting stuff back. How can they make advertisements for policies that don't actually get kind of trumped by the politics?
Sure. I mean, so to some extent, this is what we did, right? So in working with this Affordable Care Act co-op in Illinois, we created advertisements for the ACA that didn't mention Obamacare at all, because as you might suspect, mentioning Obamacare, works on Democrats pretty well, but gets Republicans disinterested in it. So, how do you do it? You avoid the topic, right? I mean, you make very clear that you don't use the term Obamacare, and you create messages that simply focus on fairness, which is what we did. And those messages worked. They caused ordinary Illinois residents, I don't know if I'm supposed to say, okay, a large Midwestern state, residents of a large Midwestern state to sign up. And only those messages caused people to sign up.
Actually, I don't know.
Go ahead, Sylvia.
I don't see any more questions here. So let me ask a question. In the meantime, we're going to get more questions. So this is the cover of the book, right? So you have a wonderful American flag there. So I would like you to elaborate whether or not you think that this is a uniquely American phenomenon or challenge or problem. But I also read your book in the way that it's something a more philosophical argument that is not just applies to America. So let me rephrase this. Is that American governments, at least in the last decades, have been bad at communicating policies? Is it that American citizens are particularly consumer citizens? Is it that sort of the question of how you frame policies is a unique challenge in the culture, sort of in the context of the political culture of this country, about attitudes about government and government policies? Can you elaborate on that?
Sure. So I'm of two minds, right? On the one hand, I think the book has evidence that this is an American phenomenon, but the book also has evidence that it's not a distinctly or uniquely American phenomenon. I've got some evidence in the book that the United Kingdom might also be a sort of host might also be a site where consumer citizenship reigns. In general, philosophically, I would view consumer citizenship as, perhaps the sort of logical implication of materialistic, prosperous societies. Interestingly, Tocqueville sort of identified some of the key traits of consumer citizenship 200 years ago, which I didn't know about until very late in the process. I read Tocqueville, never put two and two together. So, I think there's something that is American about this, but there's also something that is just more about materialism and the importance of material culture that I think this book is tapping into. So yeah, I don't think uniquely American, but certainly at work here. Does that clarify? Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
So I want to invite you now to talk a little bit about and you talk about this in the final chapter, sort of civic education, right? Like, what can you do? So one of the people points out, right, your 5th grade government story gives insight into early civic understanding, like where people start. How can parents and teachers better do civics, right? We have spent a lot of time on civic education or media literacy. You have some, I think, distinct insights that you offer, right, about how we should think about doing this. Do you want to spend some time elaborating on that?
Sure. I think, I've thought a lot about whether or not the consumer citizen paradigm can shed any light on civic education. I think it can. I think oftentimes when we think of civic education, we think of, okay, what's high school civics going to look like? You know, what are the requirements going to be to graduate? And, you know, many states have requirements, and states should have more requirements. But the consumer citizen tells us that we shouldn't restrict civic education to the classroom. We should meet people where they are, which again is often shopping for things online or in person. So again, you know, pre-COVID, you know, and sometimes in COVID, who doesn't love going to Costco, right? And you walk around, you get a free sample. You can easily imagine you're walking around, you're also connected to your representative, you're offered some information about what the government is doing. Similarly, people spend a lot of time on Amazon. Amazon does a fair bit with charity, right? In philanthropic ways that, you know, they try and get you to donate to charity. It would be actually relatively straightforward for Amazon to also set up a platform for when you buy, you would then be connected to your representatives and or political leaders or government officials. So we shouldn't make civic education end at the age of 18. Civic education should be sort of a permanent part of the American fabric, which means, in my opinion, going to where Americans are, in stores, online, or in person.
I'd like to have you reflect on maybe something that happened that arguably is kind of what your book tells people to do. Trump putting his name on stimulus checks. Connecting somehow the government is delivering. What do you think? Would you say that that's consistent with like some of what you're asking for? I mean, Democrats certainly didn't react positively to that, but I'm just curious, or maybe I'm wrong to say that that's similar to.
No, it's similar, right? I mean, Trump knows how to market himself. Unfortunately, though, government doesn't know how to market itself. That's the problem. So, you know, as I said, I have no patience for politicians who want to use the benefits of incumbency to increase their political fortunes. But quite clearly, government should make abundantly obvious to people what it is doing. You know, so I began this discussion by talking about the submerged state, right? Suzanne Mettler's idea that people don't know what government is doing for them. And that's even the case of direct government benefits. So large numbers of people who receive direct government benefits don't attribute those benefits as coming from government. In some ways, for Trump supporters, Trump, I think, was able to like stand in for all of government. But government as a whole needs to do this, making clear what it's doing. You know, Trump is maybe sort of the perverse version of this. We need to avoid that and focus on government itself and government action.
Let's stick with Trump for just one more moment, even though I hesitate to ever talk about him again. You note, right, that he's in a way, right, the culmination of this, right, kind of weird consumers thinking, and now we have Trump. But another argument about Trump's success is really not about consumer thinking. It's about racism, right? The other core things that other political scientists, you have emphasized consumer thinking, right? And brought that to the fore in, I think, a really important way. And in a weird way, our sort of old thinking about self-interest, right? You've got a much, I think, more sophisticated and better approach to understanding this. But racism, right? Group identities, polarization and partisanship. How do you think these things dovetail, or how are they going to affect, or should they be thought about given the advice you're trying to give for what should happen?
I would say two things, right? So first of all, like the book is about a new source of political behavior, not new, but a previously sort of unacknowledged source of political views and political behaviors. But like, yeah, I'd be the last person to tell you that race and partisanship don't matter. What is interesting, though, is that when I was sort of thinking about this question while writing the book, I realized that even a lot of sort of race language that people use, particularly on the right, is often suffused in consumer rhetoric, right? So think about Reagan and Cadillac, welfare queens driving Cadillacs around. There's even more recent evidence that people who are opposed to government and welfare are often using consumer language to sort of paint racist depictions of benefits of government. So consumerism remains, again, sort of, I love this idea of it's just sort of the common lingo of American politics, and it gets sort of subsumed into other areas and is used in other ways, but it's always there.
Just want to invite anybody else who has questions to just throw them up into the chat.
I see Jason Oster's chat really quickly saying, is a blurry line between, what government is doing for itself and what politicians are doing. That's why the checks are a great example. Totally agreed. And like, this is why if indeed government were to promote itself, like we would have to do so like after a lot of careful thought and deliberation about what that institution would look like that would be responsible for those messages. But again, I think it's a totally surmountable problem. I do not think it's insurmountable. It just requires work.
So one of the things that I think historically has frustrated me is that Democrats, just like Republicans, come and run against government, right? Talk about how government doesn't do good things, because this is a historical way of getting yourself elected. And yet at the same time, you offer a whole book that now tells us how that's a really stupid strategy for Democrats who ultimately want to have policies that the government is doing. Do you have any thoughts on that? Like, how can we disconnect those kind of partisan incentives? Because in a way, I sort of read your book as also trying to, yes, it's, as Sylvia said, whether you agree or disagree, but there's a way in which, there's a certain kind of, for those who want to have the government do more. And to be fair, Republicans want the government to do things too. I just wonder if you have any observations on that, like, or
well,
maybe my intuition is wrong.
So I think it's really interesting. One of the sort of, when writing the book, I was also struck in reading Republican rhetoric, how in certain occasions they're pressed, do you really want the government to do nothing? Do you really want taxes to be zero? And they actually back away. They say, no, we don't want that. This happened in a 2012 presidential debate where one of the moderators asked Michelle Bachmann, oh, so you want taxes to be zero? And she said, no, I don't want that. So there's always some part of the conservative, or Republican coalition that understands a minimal role for government. And to me, that indicates there is this kind of bipartisan interest in government working, basically. Maybe that's naive now, but that's been my thought for some time at least. I don't know if that's true any longer. I would say it's interesting, just there's one way of reading my book and being really like disappointed about the rise of the consumer citizen. And I think that's how a lot of, frankly, Democrats and progressives often respond to the consumer citizen. Oh my God, why aren't people more sophisticated by this? I remember when I was writing the book, I told a sort of liberal pundit about the book, and he said, oh my God, if that's true, that's the most depressing thing I've ever heard. And I think we've just got to push beyond that initial resignation and instead realize, like, okay, this is how people are. And ultimately, as the ideological spectrum isn't as meaningful for many people as is the sort of ubiquity of the consumer decisions that they make. And I think that can be hard to appreciate, I think.
So someone here is asking if you find any similarities between conspiracy theories and consumerism that create these kinds of personal connections.
I think there is a similarity there, but conspiracy theories are often, the work of people who are, have maybe some partisan motivation. Although they're disinterested, they might still follow politics. I would say the people I'm most interested in understanding better are the people who don't even believe in conspiracy theories, because they're like not on Reddit, they're not on, they're not on Facebook. What's interesting though is that this is where I think this is a really nice insight, is that like in a vacuum where people aren't understanding or thinking about politics in the way that like political scientists understand politics, conspiracy theories offer a sort of compelling narrative to people that might sort of fill that vacuum. But I still would say though that that basically conspiracy theories require a bit more political engagement than I think many consumer citizens are actually willing to partake in.
Before I get to a couple more questions, I do also want to invite you to, someone would like to hear what you're working on now. So this book was 8 years in the making. It's this amazing book. Now, what is your current research?
Thank you for the question. Yeah, mostly I work now on misinformation, correcting misinformation, which relates to this actually. The book details my experiments with a taxpayer receipt, where we found that actually presenting government spending in the form of a receipt increased political knowledge. And that's now led, I don't know, 7 years later, to me spending most of my time when I'm not teaching, thinking about how to improve people's political knowledge. So the work I'm doing now is related, but still, I think a little different.
Arad asks a question about, or sort of points out, right, in other countries, the way government ads are both a source of revenue for news organizations. And is there a case for dovetailing with your point that we need to do more government advertising of what it does, for advocating for government advertising as a solution to also solving sort of our crisis with respect to news funding?
I think that's a wonderful idea. I love that idea. It seems so obvious to me. I think that's fantastic. Government should advertise what it does more. You can think of this, they should, they should do so in local newspapers. And another way of thinking about government advertising, you might think of this as like bureaucrats advertising. That might be sort of a nice shorthand way to describe what I'm imagining or envisioning, and in some cases tested. It's not about Joe Biden or Kevin McCarthy putting out advertisements. It's about the people who like run the Social Security Administration putting together an advertisement. That's the kind of work we can do that to avoid that bias. I think that's in your head. I think it might be useful to think about them as leading the way.
So Professor Loge asks about the role for sort of PR about government broadly, right? Or the PR about what the American approach to democracy, which I think probably is also going to then lead to those same questions about how do you distinguish that from propaganda? But that's a piece related to the kind of stuff you talk about when you talk about trust. So how do you think about that?
Yeah, so I would say two things. I would say there's a role for PR for government services broadly. And I think that's a lot of what the book is about. The government services are marketed ineffectively, but can be marketed better. And those services are not the sum total of what government does. I mean, government also facilitates democratic deliberation. I've never tested that, but it would be interesting to know if you could improve people's support for democracy that way. I don't know the answer, to be honest with you. I guess I would, if it was just about America promoting its role. I mean, I think Voice of America maybe that's what Peter's envisioning. I don't know. And Voice of America can't work domestically, which I think makes sense too. I mean, I don't think we want to just do sort of raw propaganda in this country. We have an allergy to that, and I would say rightly so. But there's another kind of basic info. Advertising is basic information that we could do. One last point on this that I'll make. At lower levels of government, we do this all the time, right? So you go to a big city in non-COVID times, and they'll tell you, "Hey, here's how you get your government services. Sign up here for this kind of government benefits. Sign up here." It's only at the national level that actually we don't do this, which is unfortunate because the national level is where so much of government spending actually occurs. So there's a weird disconnect in this country between our willingness to tolerate government advertising at the local level, but our distrust of it at the national level, that I think we should resolve.
Just since we only have a few minutes left, thinking about sort of the other side of the SMPA house from the political communication side. So in a way, talking about government sort of advertising, what we do, right, is a piece. How do you think about the way in which journalism could be a piece of this, and the way in which we cover things, or what kinds of focus journalists have? Often the story about bad government gets a lot of attention. Is there a place there that you also would see?
Yeah, so so much, and we're seeing this now, I think, already with the Biden administration, that political journalism gets reduced to a story of debates and arguments over process, right? Where did you do, and ultimately journalists would be well served and the public would be well served. I believe the latter, certainly, I want to believe journalists would be well served to focus on policy from a nuts and bolts individual perspective. What's at stake for this policy for you individually? How would that affect you as a sort of average person? That coverage is rare. And I think actually, I think, and again, I don't know, but if I had to speculate based on some of what I've observed, I think people would respond to that kind of coverage. People want to know if their taxes are going up or if they're getting more benefits. People respond to that kind of information. You know, process bores people. You know, having to, get, a new government benefit or pay a new government cost. People actually really like that. Like learning about it. They don't like it all the time.
Well, I think we're kind of reaching the end of our time, so I'm going to let Silvio have the last word, but I just want to thank everybody for joining us. This is, again, I recommend buying the book, and this has been a great conversation.
Thank you so much.
Thank you both, Kim and Ethan, for such a great conversation. I can envision having lots of conversations in the classroom based on this book. It's just, again, thought-provoking book. There are so many questions that you raised and so many ways of approaching the way that we talk about it. So thank you both for the conversation. Thank you all for coming. This is great. We're going to do more things. Congratulations again, Ethan, for writing such a great book. And I hope that it gets the attention and the audience it deserves.
Thank you so much. It was so wonderful. Thank you.
So thank you very much. And thank you, everybody, for coming, and have a good night. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.